This is the Kestrel V2 installation video in my 3-part video series on the EShooter Kestrel V2 Mosfet.
Once everything is cleaned and ready, we'll start on the lower shell. As a special note, if you haven't shimmed your gearbox, now is the time to do it before you start putting in a new MOSFET or wiring. To start with the MOSFET install, gently hold the MOSFET in place without pressing down on it. You want to hold it carefully to avoid the rear sensors from contacting the gearbox shell. Check first that you have adequate clearance at the front face on all the holes, screw points, pegs, and that an equal distance can be achieved around your sector gear bushing. Very gently hold the MOSFET in place and flip the gearbox over to see how the sensors look on the back. As you can see here, the third sensor for full auto detection is completely covered by the gearbox shell, and this part of the gearbox has to be ground, dremeled, or filed out first. What I'm going to do is mark out a width using a white paint pen to identify the amount to grind off. That way when the paint pen mark is gone, I know I have removed enough material. It's a bit of a guess and check. Before we go grinding away, let's check the fit and clearance on the top side of the MOSFET board and shell in a similar manner. For the top board, you can place it down against the gearbox shell since there are no sensors on its backside. Check to make sure the MOSFET has adequate clearance to the nub sticking off the shell. Check clearance near the sector gear sensor by any holes through the gearbox and around the top of the board. When you remove the MOSFET board, there may be a guide protrusion under the board on the gearbox causing it to fit a little bit too tight. In my case, I'll file that off as well, but we'll recheck this later on once you attempt to close the gearbox the first time. I like to use sanding style tips for my Dremel to work with fine material removal. With an aggressive head or cutting disc, you might accidentally overdo it very easily. I combine gentle Dremel heads and hand filing for the best outcome and controlled removal. Once you're done filing and grinding, make sure to rinse, clean, and dry the gearbox to get all the metal shavings out. We need to start by mounting the lower board. We need to recheck the clearance to make sure it's adequate and to make sure that enough material is removed. Repeat the same steps to check the selector plate sensor view and to check clearance around the MOSFET board where all the grinding was required. There should be nothing behind it to damage the selector sensors if you filed it out correctly. Now open the connector set package, take out the M2 mounting screw and also the plum blossom metal washer that's included. Note that this is one difference from a Titan installation and that an isolation washer is not included and instead you get a plum blossom metal washer. Also take out the appropriate mounting shims or washers if you need them. They come in 0.2 to 0.5mm thickness. These shims are included to ensure the mounting screw depth does not protrude through the back of your gearbox shell too far. If your screw is too long, then just add a washer under the head of the screw to shim it back a bit, or you could just file the screw to length. As you install the screw, just be careful that the washers don't meet any contacts within the board as you install them. Gently route the wires into the gearbox shell guide. I use a wide, non-pointy screwdriver such as a fat Allen key head to press the wires in place. You don't want to tear the wiring insulation by using something too sharp-edged or by pushing too aggressively. When you route the wires, you want to make sure that your motor won't catch on them. I actually glue my wires down to avoid the issue, but this makes it a bit tough to remove later. We'll go over that in a little bit more detail later on. You also want to make sure that the wires near the trigger will clear your trigger's movements. Now we could set the top MOSFET board in place. For the Kestrel, there's this additional micro switch that's not seen on the Titan. The switch allows for mag detection to ensure that you actually change your magazine for a 30 round limit mode. Be careful with this switch and avoid repeatedly bending the wires. As we're just test fitting, you can leave the switch just hanging or sticking out the front and it does not need to be mounted at this time. We just want to dry fit this with no other components and gently close the two halves of the gearbox shell together to see if there are any binding points. Gently align the two halves of the gearbox shell and don't put any screws in. Only use gentle finger pressure to see if it'll even close evenly and if it closes up completely on all edges. For my gearbox, it seems there's a metal protrusion on the top shell half that presses against the MOSFET board too hard so it won't close evenly. I took a Dremel and a hand file and I simply got rid of it. Another thing I noticed was that the MOSFET board thickness was a little bit thinner than my last trigger unit and it sat lower in the shell. The mounting screw included with the MOSFET didn't actually hold it firmly. To resolve this, you may need to gently sand or file down the little post that your mounting screw goes through so that the height of the post is flush or slightly lower than the MOSFET board to ensure the washer holds the board down firmly. Also in my case, the M2 screw did not work for me. I actually ended up stripping the hole in my gearbox shell a little bit from my last trigger unit install, so I needed an M2.5 or a slightly larger diameter screw. I ended up grinding an old screw from a hard drive case as it was the perfect diameter but too long. Once the board mounting screw is installed, don't forget to check that the board's installed flat and it's not sticking up unevenly. You can look at the board from a shallow or low angle to see this. It is normal for the board not to sit perfectly flat or flush to the gearbox shell, and there could be a small gap appearing, which is usually fine, but it should not protrude up so much as to get caught on the sector gear or trigger. Test fit a second time until you can completely close the gearbox shell with gentle hand pressure. Sometimes you may need to grind the nubs off the gearbox shell near the wire run if they cannot fit with the wires. If you're noticing that this is the point where it's binding during closing your gearbox shell, you can sand or grind the nubs down. In my case, I just put firm pressure over these zones and allowed the wires to shape to the nubs. In that case, I could keep the nubs in place. Next, you want to close the gearbox shell with only the Mosfet board, both halves, and the trigger in with no spring. Do this gently and slowly to ensure the trigger has a free range of movement and to make sure it's not catching on wires or any part of the Mosfet board. Once it's clear, remove the components and reinstall with the Selector gear. I like to put in just the Selector gear first and check with an open shell to make sure that it's clearing the bottom Mosfet board. I also check that the Mosfet board sensors for the gear pickup are aligned correctly. Check the picture within the manual to see how this should look. Now let's add on the top Mosfet board and make sure everything is clear to the Selector gear. Finally, install the trigger with spring, the Selector, and both halves of the Mosfet board together. When I install the trigger and spring together, typically I like to keep a finger on the trigger to ensure it doesn't move around. If the trigger pops off, it could damage the sensors on the Mosfet board. Fit the gearbox with both shell halves closed and ensure everything can move freely with the gearbox closed using a few screws to close the gearbox shell. With the Mosfet now installed and the trigger and Selector gear in, we only need to add the selector plate and we can move on to test and calibrate the sensors. Just be mindful that the whole process is two-step. You need to do selector calibration and then also sensor setup. To start with the sensor checking and calibration, first go to the App Store and search EShooter to download the app. Ensure your Bluetooth connection is enabled and set permissions for the Kestrel V2 to start searching for devices. I will go through full app features and Mosfet testing in a separate video. First time password is 888888 or 6 8s. You can change this later if you want. Start on the Sensor tab. Enable sensor testing and start by checking the trigger. You should be able to pull the trigger freely and the Mosfet will detect on all 5 sensors. Note that it is normal for some of the sensors not to be available or to be blocked by your trigger. This just may mean that you can't use all of the trigger sensitivity settings. Spin the Selector gear to ensure the tooth pickup detection is functioning. We can also check this later on to see how active brake and precock are working. Lastly, you want to check the selector plate detection. This selector plate has a metal reflective backing and it might work without adding a white sticker on it. Let's try it out. For this, you should install the gearbox shell into the lower receiver to ensure the correct position of the selector plate is being used. I'm going to skip showing a failed initial test, but for this particular build, the original metal-backed selector plate did not end up working properly despite my best efforts. That's okay because they've included a generous amount of selector plate stickers to try out instead. I simply removed the metal backing and installed the fattest line selector plate sticker based on trial and error after starting from the thinnest black line sticker. You should always start from the thinnest to the fattest line to get optimum detection. If you end up running out of stickers, you can also use any type of white sticker and apply permanent marker on the edge to darken it. It's important to install the dark edge of the sticker on the left side of the selector plate when you're looking at it during sticker installation. The dark line or edge ensures that a light reflection off an adjacent sensor is not picked up simultaneously. Going back to the app, we can perform calibration. Note that this next step differs from other similar Mosfets like the Titan. When we say selector calibration, we don't just mean checking that the 3 selector settings are picked up correctly. There's actually an additional and very neat feature of automatic selector plate calibration. Once the calibration is complete, read the warning and unplug the battery back out of the app and then reconnect everything to continue on. I don't know exactly what the automatic calibration does, but I suspect it tunes the detection angle and sensitivity of the sensors as well as possibly other things. Before I noticed this step of the installation manual, I actually struggled with my selector plate detection and I missed the calibration stage completely. If you skip calibration, then there's a good chance that one or more of your sensors won't pick up correctly. In my case, I could not get safe mode to detect unless the reflective sheet or sticker were directly beside the sensor on a perpendicular angle at a very close proximity. As soon as I ran the calibration, all my problems were solved and it worked like a charm as expected. I do want to note that the first time you boot up the app, you're supposed to get a prompt to perform selector plate calibration or enter calibration mode when you're starting the app for the first time. This initial message didn't end up popping up for me, which is also probably another reason why I missed this unique step. I mentioned this to EShooter and they've issued app corrections and updates. With calibration done and all sensors detecting correctly, I'm going to fix the wiring under the motor with metal epoxy. This step is optional and a personal preference. I just place a small dab of metal epoxy on a clean and grease-free shell, and then I use toothpicks to press the wiring down while the epoxy cures overnight. Make sure that everything is level by looking at a low angle and that your motor won't clip the wires as you insert it. Be cautious if you go this route, as removing the epoxy does require some aggressive methods and can damage the wiring if you're not careful. This also makes future maintenance of your AEG a little bit more difficult, as the wiring and lower Mosfet board can't be removed easy. With the wiring set into place, let's finish placing the wire run in the rear guide. Be sure to only use a wide non-pointy head tool to press wiring into the guides, as you do not want to tear the installation. I like to set the heat shrink tube to protect the pinch point at the rear of the gearbox shell where the wiring exits. Just slide the heat shrink to your desired position and use the blue heat of a flame to set it. You may also want to add electrical tape to any additional or loose wiring ends to avoid snagging them in the future. As noted in my first review video, the external fuse could be removed at your own risk if it's too bulky for your build. I found the external fuse to add quite a bit of length to the wiring run such that it will project quite a ways out of the buffer tube. Personally, I cut a slot in the side of my buffer tube and I like to run my wiring as short as possible. As such, I don't normally run external fuses, but this is my own risk. In this particular case, I opted to keep the fuse so I could test the MOSFET in its truest form possible. In such a case, you can also coil the wiring inside the buffer tube to keep the overall projection length down, which is what I've done. Now that everything is in, it's a good time to clean and re-grease your internal components while you have your gearbox open and all the parts out. If you want to see a guide on that process, be sure to check out my other maintenance videos including full teardown steps on an M4A1 as well as my regular clean and re-grease process.
As you grease your gears, you want to make sure not to put too much grease on the sector gear. Excess grease can get flung on the MOSFET board and it can also obstruct the tooth detection.
When closing your gearbox with a Kestrel, be sure to route the 30 round mag switch out the central or middle hole of your gearbox shell and not the bottom like I did. I tried to run the wiring out the bottom slot and I actually found the wiring may get squished a little bit between the gearbox shell and the lower receiver. While it didn't end up damaging the wiring, it did squish the insulation more than I would like to see. I do want to caution that if you route it out the forward hole of your gearbox that you're going to need to be very careful when inserting your mag release switch here because it can be easily caught on if there's any projecting wire from the switch. With the MOSFET installed, you can now set aside a bunch of internal parts as we will not be needing them anymore. This includes the cutoff lever, selector plate spring, trigger stop and spring, trigger trolley and trigger unit, including any old wiring or old mounting screws. Note at this stage in the MOSFET installation, the mag switch was still intact for me. When you're fitting the switch, you want to check if the 3 metal leads contact your gearbox shell. In my case, the metal leads did contact my gearbox shell, and this can cause a risk of short circuiting. If you watch some of the EShooter videos carefully, you can see that they have the 3 metal leads bent 90 degrees to avoid contacting the gearbox shell. I had mentioned this to them as well, and I believe corrections will be made for future units shipped out. In my case, when I resoldered the wires on the switch, I just added a thin heat shrink tube and bent the leads 90 degrees to prevent risk of short circuiting.
To mount the 30 round mag switch, just use the provided screw and washer if needed, and screw through the hole where the trigger stop used to be.
The Kestrel also comes with an extension arm for the 30 round mag switch in the case that the mag switch does not project far enough out into your lower receiver to properly engage with your magazine. You want the switch to stick in far enough to be engaged by the magazine, but not so far as to cause binding or magazine fitment issues. You can check how this is seated if you install an empty magazine and look from the top, the side, and the mag wall from all angles with the flashlight and make sure the switch is contacted by the magazine properly as you insert it. I can see the switch causing issues in some guns that already have magazine compatibility problems. For such builds, you may wish to opt out for the switch completely and simply remove it, as it can possibly cause more magazine fitment issues for sensitive builds. If you remove the switch, just be cautious that it may void your warranty. After I assembled my gearbox for the first time with Kestrel, I realized I needed to fine-tune my gearbox shimming, which resulted in me having to repeatedly open and close the gearbox shell to test fire. The process of repeatedly opening and closing the shell also meant handling the MOSFET board and switch multiple times. This caused repeated stress or fatigue on the wiring of the 30 round mag switch, which eventually broke off. The first time it broke, the wiring broke off the switch itself, but I just resoldered the switch onto the wiring ends. After additional fiddling with internals and shimming, the 30 round switch actually broke right off the MOSFET board as well. I had mentioned this risk of fatigue breaking the wiring off to EShooter, and I believe they're investigating improvements to the connection or wiring design for this switch. You could try to pick off the silicone and resolder the wires directly to the board if you really want the switch. However, I owed this process a complete test to the end, and I didn't want to risk damaging the MOSFET board attempting to resolder the wires on, so I decided just to leave the switch out. You should be cautious if you're resoldering components as it may void your warranty. If your switch wires break off during basic handling or installation, your best bet is to contact EShooter directly for further steps. As you bend your motor wire connectors, make sure you bend them the correct way. See the illustration in the manual for more detail. You bend them towards you while the crimped end is facing you. If you mess this step up, the motor wire connectors may break. However, EShooter has included a spare set and heat shrink if you need to install a fresh set. Overall, I do have to give the 30 round mag switch a negative review for the user installation process and for potential risks of voiding warranty. Although it's a neat feature and innovative design, I don't personally use the 30 round mag mode, so I'd prefer to opt out of this feature right from the factory if possible. This would allow me to avoid any issues such as cutting the switch out or voiding my warranty. It'd be very neat if a version of the MOSFET was offered where the switch was optional so that it could be shipped with or without the switch with valid warranty right from the factory. Don't forget that when your gun is in safe mode, you'll no longer have the trigger stop, so your trigger may see the full range of movement. Rest assured, if your selector plate sensor picked up safe mode correctly, it will not fire. Now that everything is installed, including the internals, let's do a brief test fire to make sure everything's in working order. Let's finish by installing the upper receiver and running the wiring out the rear. Be careful when you kink the wiring. You need to bend it up and out towards the buffer tube, but you want to make sure that it clears the buffer tube screw. At this point, you may wish to coil your wiring in the buffer tube to minimize the length sticking out of the end of the tube. I personally cut a slot in my buffer tube to let me access wiring from a side pull so that I can collapse my stock all the way without compressing or pinching on the connector wired end. In conclusion, EShooter has come out with a great product here. I think the Mosfet installation can be a little bit tricky, so I urge caution to new techs if you feel uncomfortable with any of the steps or oddities discussed during this Mosfet installation. Be sure to check out my other 2 videos for the Mosfet review, application overview, and Mosfet test firing.